The moment I remember most clearly isn't the kiss at the altar, or the way Daniel looked at me when I walked down the aisle in my grandmother's restored dress. It isn't the flowers, those enormous cream peonies we'd spent 3 weeks arguing over with the florist. It isn't even the cake, which collapsed slightly on one side and which I'd laughed about for hours in the bridal suite while my maid of honor tried to fix it with a spatula and determination. What I remember most clearly is standing in front of 112 people in the Caldwell barn, which we'd rented for exactly this reason, its warm wooden beams, its string lights, its smell of cedar and old hay, and hearing my mother's voice cut through the room like a fire alarm. "That's not how it happened," she said. "And everyone here knows it. My name is Claire." I was 34 years old on my wedding day, a secondary school English teacher from Millhaven, Ohio, and I had been planning that speech for 4 months. 4 months of drafts scribbled in the margins of lesson plans, 4 months of reading it to my bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning while Daniel was still asleep, 4 months of cutting lines that were too sentimental and adding ones that were honest. It was supposed to be 2 minutes and 40 seconds long, I'd timed it. It was supposed to be funny in the first half and quiet and true in the second. It was supposed to end with a toast. It ended with my mother standing up from table 3 and telling me, in front of my husband, his family, my colleagues, and every person I'd chosen to share this day with, that I was lying. I need to tell you something important about my mother before I explain what happened next. Her name is Renata. She is 61 years old, 5 feet 4, and she has the kind of posture that makes people assume she was once a dancer. She wasn't, she was a legal secretary for 30 years, which gave her the same quality but for different reasons, the posture of someone who has spent decades making other people's documents look perfect while waiting for them to say thank you. She loves orchids, hates clutter, and speaks in a way that sounds reasonable even when nothing she is saying is reasonable at all. My father left when I was 9. Not dramatically, no shouting, no thrown dishes, just a Tuesday in November when I came home from school and his coat was gone from the hook by the door. My mother never explained it to me. She simply said, "Your father has made his choices," in the tone she uses for facts that are too painful to look at directly. I spent my entire childhood understanding that what had happened was his fault entirely and that asking follow-up questions was a form of disloyalty. I am telling you this because it matters. All of it matters. Daniel and I had been together for 6 years before the wedding. We met at a continuing education evening hosted by the Millhaven Library. He was there for a seminar on local architectural history. I was there because I'd confused the room numbers and walked into the wrong lecture. He was 37 to my 28, a structural engineer with quiet hands and a habit of drawing floor plans on napkins when he was nervous. On our first date he explained to me, entirely unprompted, how a cantilevered beam distributes weight. I found it endearing. I still do. We'd moved in together after 2 years. We'd talked about children in the abstract way people do when they're not quite ready but can feel themselves getting there. We'd survived his mother's health scare, my department being restructured, 3 apartments and 1 house. By the time we got engaged, the relationship had the texture of something real, not perfect, but real. Worked on. Chosen. My mother had never particularly liked Daniel. She was not rude about it in the ways that would have been easy to name and argue with. She was careful. She would say things like, "He seems very set in his ways," when what she meant was, "He has opinions that don't defer to mine." She would pause slightly too long before agreeing that yes, the house was lovely, yes, the kitchen was functional. She would find small errors, a mispronounced surname, a political opinion she quietly disagreed with, and hold them up to the light the way a jeweler holds a suspect stone. I noticed. I told myself it was generational. I told myself she'd come around. The speech I wrote for my wedding was about 3 things: the library, the floor plans on napkins, and a specific Tuesday in February when Daniel drove 40 minutes in the snow to bring me soup because I'd texted him that I was sick and too tired to cook. It wasn't a glamorous love story. That was the point. It was about smallness, about dailiness, about choosing a person in the ordinary moments when nothing is witnessed. The section my mother interrupted was the 3rd part. The soup part. I called him at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, I said, holding the small index card I'd written the speech on, and he didn't ask me if I needed anything. He just said he'd be there in 40 minutes. Claire. Her voice was conversational. That was what made it worse. I looked up. She was already standing, her champagne glass still in her hand, her orchid pink dress absolutely pressed. That's not how it happened, she said again. And everyone here knows it. The room went so quiet I could hear the string lights buzzing. Let me go back, because the wedding didn't happen in a vacuum. Nothing does. The 3 months leading up to the ceremony had been the most organized and the most exhausting of my life, and not in equal measure. Daniel had been wonderful about the planning, steadier than I was, more patient with vendors, better at responding to emails at 10 p.m. without his voice going flat. But he had also been distracted, in a way I couldn't quite name. Not absent. Just not entirely present either. It started, I think, in January. We were eating dinner, pasta, something easy, a Tuesday, when his phone buzzed on the table between us and he turned it face down without looking at it. I noticed because he wasn't someone who typically bothered. He usually just glanced at whatever it was and set it aside. Work? I said. Probably, he said. I didn't ask again. That was my error, not asking. I've thought about it since, turned it over the way you turn something in your hands when you're trying to feel the weight of it. But at the time it seemed small. The phone buzzed again. He reached over and silenced it. Over the weeks that followed I catalogued things without meaning to. A late call from the car while I was already upstairs. A browser tab closed a fraction faster than it needed to be. A shift in the texture of his silences, still familiar, but with something underneath them I couldn't identify. I told myself it was wedding stress. Daniel had never been someone who found large social events easy. The thought of standing in front of 100 people and performing sentiment was genuinely difficult for him, and I'd known that when I accepted his proposal. I also told myself, and this is the part I'm less proud of, that if something were seriously wrong, I'd be able to tell. This is a lie we tell ourselves in long relationships. 6 years of intimacy creates a kind of confidence about knowing someone that is sometimes accurate and sometimes catastrophically wrong. I was relying on my own perception as evidence, which is not the same as evidence. My mother noticed something different. She came to visit in February, ostensibly to look at the venue with me, to weigh in on centerpieces, to do the things mothers of brides do when they're involved and invested. We drove out to the Caldwell barn on a Saturday morning, and she walked through the space slowly with her arms folded and her eyes moving across the beams, the stone fireplace, the way the afternoon light came in through the western windows. She didn't say anything critical. That was how I knew she wanted to. In the car on the way back she said, "Daniel didn't come." "He had a meeting," I said. A pause. "On a Saturday." "Engineering doesn't take weekends off," I said, which was true enough that I believed it at the time. She made the sound she makes, not a sigh, not quite, more like a breath that means I'm choosing not to say more but want you to know that I could. I turned up the radio. She turned it back down. "I'm just saying," she said, "that when your father was pulling away, there were signs. And I wished someone had pointed them out to me." "Daniel is not pulling away," I said. "I'm sure you're right," she said, and looked out the passenger window. That was February. In March, Daniel's sister Petra called me. Petra is 2 years younger than him, a no-nonsense woman who works in pharmaceutical sales and says what she means with such directness that it occasionally startles people in conversations. She is also, quietly, one of my favorite people. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon when I was marking essays at the kitchen table. "Just checking in," she said. "You never just check in," I said. "A beat." "No," she said. "I don't." She paused. "Is Danny doing okay? He seemed off when I saw him last weekend." "Off how?" "Tired. Distracted. Not sad, specifically. Just like he's carrying something." She paused again. "Did something happen with you too?" "No," I said. "We're fine." "Okay," she said, and left it there, but the words sat with me for the rest of the evening. I brought it up with Daniel that night. Not directly, I don't bring things up directly, which is a flaw I have acknowledged in myself. I asked him if he was sleeping okay, if work was manageable, if he was looking forward to the wedding. He answered all three questions thoughtfully and honestly, or so I believed. He said the project he was on was stressful but almost wrapped up. He said he was looking forward to the wedding more than he could explain and just wished the weeks between now and then would go faster. He reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was exactly what it had always been. I believed him. I wanted to believe him, which is not the same thing, but in that moment they felt identical. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, what I wouldn't know until the reception, until the bathroom, until the phone, was that Daniel had been carrying something for 8 months. Not what I'd feared. Not what my mother had implied. Something entirely different. Something that, when I finally understood it, rearranged not just the present but the whole past, the way discovering a wrong equation changes every number that followed it. April arrived with the specific anxiety of a month that contains your wedding. We finalized the menu, the seating chart, the order of service. We argued mildly about the playlist. Daniel wanted more Springsteen, I wanted less. We agreed on a compromise that satisfied neither of us and which we both quietly liked. His family came for a rehearsal dinner that was warm and slightly chaotic, and during which his Uncle Marvin gave a toast that was technically about Daniel but was mostly about a fishing trip they'd taken in 1998. My mother sat at the rehearsal dinner with the posture of someone attending a formal review. She smiled when smiles were required. She said the food was lovely and the venue was beautiful, and when Daniel leaned over to tell her that he was glad she was there, she said, "Of course," in a way that technically meant yes. She found me in the hallway afterward, while the tables were being cleared. "The speech," she said. "What are you planning to say?" I told her. Not all of it, the broad strokes, the themes. The library, the napkins, the soup. She listened. She nodded once. "Is any of it about your father?" she asked. "No," I said. "Why would it be?" "I'm just asking," she said. I went back to the party. She followed me, and for the rest of the evening was the version of herself that guests found charming, attentive, gracious, lightly funny about the logistics. Nobody watching her from across the room would have known anything. But I'd lived with her long enough to know that when she asked a question like that, quiet, angled, with no obvious context, she was not simply curious. She was preparing something. I just didn't know what. The wedding morning was one of those May days that arrive in Ohio like an apology for the rest of spring, warm, genuinely warm, with a sky so clear it seemed almost artificial. I woke up in the hotel room I'd booked for myself and my 2 bridesmaids, my maid of honor Simone and my college friend Bex, and I lay still for a moment listening to the particular quiet of a morning that is going to become one of the fixed points of your life. Simone was already awake, sitting by the window with coffee and her phone, reading something. Bex was still asleep with her face pressed into a pillow. "How are you feeling?" Simone asked. "Calm," I said, and meant it, which surprised me. "Nervous about the speech." "You've read it 100 times. 112, I said. She smiled. "You'll be fine." The morning moved the way wedding mornings do, in pieces, in small ceremonies within the ceremony. Hair and makeup, which took longer than planned and during which Bex made everyone laugh twice by commenting on the mascara. The dress, which needed 4 hands to do up properly and which, when finally on, was everything I'd hoped. My grandmother had married in it in 1961. We'd had it taken in, re-seamed, the lace along the collar restored by a woman in Columbus who did this kind of work as her entire life's focus. It smelled faintly of cedar and something older I couldn't name. My mother arrived at 11 with her own hair already done. She kissed my cheek, took a step back, looked at the dress. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she said, and her voice was entirely genuine. In moments like these I loved her completely and without complication. We drove to the Caldwell barn in the early afternoon. The guests arrived in the golden hour that preceded the ceremony. I watched them from the bridal suite window without being seen, a small pleasure. Daniel's colleagues in their summer suits. My department head Margot, who had brought a gift wrapped in newspaper because she was philosophically opposed to wrapping paper. Petra, in a green dress, arriving with her husband and their 2 kids. Old friends, new friends, the particular cross-section of a life shared between 2 people. I didn't see Daniel until the ceremony. That's traditional, and I'd insisted on it, and when he turned at the altar and looked at me, really looked at me, the way he had across a room in a library 6 years before, I understood why people insist on it. The breath you lose is worth the wait. We were married in 12 minutes. The officiant was a friend of Daniel's from university named Marcus, who was not ordained in any traditional sense but had done the paperwork, and who told 2 jokes during the ceremony that were genuinely funny and one that wasn't, and who cried slightly during the vows, which nobody had expected but which made everyone feel safe enough to cry too. During the dinner that followed, I noticed my mother watching Daniel. Not obtrusively, she wasn't staring, wasn't leaning forward, but watching in the careful, sustained way she has when she's decided something. I caught it twice. The second time she seemed to realize I'd noticed and looked back to the conversation she was having with a woman to her left. Daniel was to my right during dinner, and he was present, more present than he'd been in months, actually, the tension I'd been trying not to name gone from his shoulders, his laugh lighter. He told a story about the first time he'd met my department head that had our table going for 2 full minutes. He refilled my water without my asking. He put his hand on the small of my back when he stood to greet someone and left it there longer than he needed to. Whatever he'd been carrying, I thought, he'd set it down for today. I noticed his phone on the table, screen down, the same habit I'd catalogued in January. I didn't think about it much. There were 100 people in the room and the band had started its first set and Bex had already attempted to pull my department head onto the dance floor, unsuccessfully. The speeches were scheduled for 8 o'clock, during the lull between dinner and dessert. Daniel's best man, his friend and colleague Tom, went first, a solid, warm speech with 2 solid, warm jokes and a line at the end about Daniel that made me press my hand against my sternum because it was so precisely true. Then Petra, who was funnier than anyone expected and who said, near the end, "I've never seen my brother look at anyone the way he looks at Claire, and I've been watching him for 35 years, so that is a statement with data behind it." Then it was my turn. I stood up with my index card. The room settled. Daniel looked at me with the expression I knew better than almost any other in the world, open, waiting, entirely mine. I started at the beginning. The library. The wrong room. The structural engineering lecture. I could feel the room with me, small laughs in the right places, quiet in the right places. I moved to the napkins, which got more laughs because I'd brought one as a prop, an actual napkin with an actual floor plan on it, salvaged from our second date, which I'd inexplicably kept. More laughter. Daniel covered his face. Then I moved to the soup. I was 3 sentences in when my mother stood up. The room went quiet in that particular way large rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens, not all at once but in a wave, as conversations at the far tables noticed the shift in atmosphere and tapered off to hear what was happening. "That's not how it happened," she said again. "And everyone here knows it." I looked at her. My voice, when I found it, was remarkably level. "Mom," I said. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry, "but I've been sitting here listening to this and I think people deserve to hear the full picture." "This is my wedding speech," I said. "I know what it is." Daniel had turned in his chair. I could see him in my peripheral vision, very still, very controlled, watching my mother with an expression I didn't have a name for yet. "Renata." That was Petra, from table 7, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "This isn't the time." "I disagree," my mother said. She was still standing. She had not put down her champagne glass. What she said next, and I need to be precise about this, was not obviously cruel. That was what made it so disorienting. She didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't make a scene in the theatrical sense. She spoke clearly and calmly, the way she had spoken to me my whole life when she was correcting something. "Claire's father left," she said, addressing not me but the room at large, "because Claire asked him to. She was 9 years old and she told her father she didn't want him to come home anymore. Children don't understand what they're saying at that age. But I've watched my daughter for 25 years tell the story of an absent father without ever taking any responsibility for the part she played. The silence that followed was total. I stood at the microphone with my index card and felt the blood leave my face. "That is not what happened," I said. "I was there," she said. "So was I said. What she had said was not entirely without a kernel of truth, and this was its particular cruelty. When I was 9, during one of the last arguments my parents had before my father left, I had said something. In the kitchen, crying, upset about something I couldn't even reconstruct now, I'd said something along the lines of, "I wish you'd just go." Children say this. Children say the worst things available to them in pain. It is not the same as asking a parent to leave. It is not the same as a 9-year-old dismantling a marriage. My mother had held this for 25 years and chosen my wedding reception to deliver it. I stood very still. I was aware of my breathing. Then Daniel pushed back his chair. He didn't stand up dramatically. He didn't raise his voice. He reached over to the table, picked up his phone, the one that had been face down all evening, and looked at the screen. Whatever he saw there, he looked at it for 2 or 3 seconds. Then he stood. "Claire," he said quietly. "Can you give me a moment?" I looked at him. Something in his face, not anxiety, exactly, something more focused than anxiety, made me step back from the microphone without speaking. He walked to my mother's table. He pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down. I watched him put his phone on the table between them, screen up, and say something very quietly that I couldn't hear. My mother looked at the phone. The color in her face changed. I started walking toward them. I was halfway there when I heard someone at table 6 begin to cry. Let me tell you what was on that phone, because this is the part that changes everything. 8 months before the wedding, in September, when Daniel had first started turning his phone face down, when Petra had first said he seemed like he was carrying something, he had received a message from my father. My father, whose name is Robert, who had left in November when I was 9, who I had not seen or spoken to in 17 years, who I had long ago made a private peace with by simply ceasing to wonder about. The message had come through Facebook, because that is how people find each other when they've been lost long enough. My father had found Daniel's profile through mine. He had sent a message, long, careful, revised, would later understand, that said, in essence, "I have been trying to find a way to reach my daughter for years. I know she may not want to hear from me. I know I have no right to ask anything of her. But she is getting married, and I don't want her to walk into that marriage not knowing something I should have told her long ago." What he told Daniel, over the course of several messages, across 2 months, was this. He had not left because of anything Claire did or said. He had left because Renata had asked him to. She had found out about a debt, a serious one, accumulated over 3 years, the kind that accrues interest and demands decisions, that he had hidden from her. She had given him a choice: leave quietly and let her tell their daughter whatever she needed to tell her, or stay and have it all become public in a way that would be worse for everyone. He had believed, in the specific and cowardly way of people who choose the easiest exit, that leaving would be less damaging than the alternative. He had been wrong. He'd understood that for 25 years. He'd just been too ashamed to say so. The thing he wanted Claire to know, the thing he had asked Daniel to decide whether to share, was this, the line her mother had repeated to her for a lifetime, that her father had made his choices, was true in only the narrowest sense. He had made choices. But the choice to go had been her mother's ultimatum, and the choice about what story Claire grew up with had been her mother's to make alone. Daniel had sat with this for 8 months. He had not told me immediately because he was a structural engineer and he approached damage the way he approached buildings. He needed to understand the load before he decided whether the structure could bear it. He had been quietly, carefully trying to decide whether knowing this would help me or hurt me, and at what moment, and in what way. He had been drawing floor plans on the back of the situation, trying to find the weight-bearing walls. He had decided to tell me after the wedding, on our honeymoon, in a moment that would be calm and private and mine. My mother's interruption had changed the timing. Because what he had shown her, there at table 3 with his phone between them and the room watching, was my father's message. The whole thread. 8 months of it. Her husband's account, his explanation, and at the very end, my father's request: please don't let Renata tell Claire it was her fault. She was 9 years old. She was just a child. My mother looked at the phone for a very long time. When she looked up, I was standing in front of her. How long have you known? I said to Daniel. Since September, he said. The room was not watching us the way rooms watch things on screens. It was watching us the way rooms watch things that are real, uncomfortably, with the specific wish that this was not happening but the inability to look away. I was aware of this in a removed, observational way, the way you sometimes notice yourself from a distance in moments of extremity. You should have told me, I said. I know, he said. I'm sorry. I wanted to get it right. I looked at my mother. Her face was doing something I had never seen it do before. The specific architecture of her composure, the posture, the control, the careful management of what she showed the world, was still technically present but visibly under strain, the way a building looks in the moment before something gives. She was not crying. She was not going to cry, not here, not in front of these people. But she was not going to be composed either, not fully. You told me it was my fault, I said. I never said it was your fault, she said, immediately. I said. You let me believe it, I said. For 25 years. You told me I'd said something. You let me carry that. I was protecting you, she said. From what? From knowing that your father left because he was a coward who'd been hiding money for 3 years and couldn't face the consequences. That was not yours to decide, I said. The room around us, and I was aware of this in pieces, not all at once, had gone very, very still. Not everyone could hear everything we were saying, but enough could, and the ones who could were telling the ones who couldn't in quick, low exchanges that rippled outward. I was 9, I said. I thought I made him leave. Her mouth tightened. You didn't make him leave. I know that now, I said. Because of my husband. Who has been carrying this for 8 months trying to figure out how to protect me. Because that is what you do when you love someone, you try to find the right way to tell them the truth. You don't bury the truth and then use it as ammunition at their wedding because they're saying something in a speech that makes you uncomfortable. The precision of her face cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. I didn't mean, she started. What did you mean? I said. And then I stopped, because there were tears on my face that I hadn't given permission for. I put my hand against my cheek. What did you actually mean to do, Mom? Standing up in front of 100 people and telling my husband's family and my colleagues and everyone we've chosen to include in our lives that I was responsible for my father leaving? On my wedding day? She said nothing. Because I have a theory, I said. I think you knew. I think you've always known that I told the story of Dad leaving as a thing that happened to me. And some part of you, the part that has been angry at him for 25 years and angrier still that I eventually stopped being angry, wanted me to share the blame. Not because it was true. Because it was easier. That's not fair, she said. Which part? Silence. It was Petra who spoke next. She had moved from her table to somewhere behind Daniel, close enough to hear, far enough to give us space. She spoke directly to my mother, in the tone I'd come to recognize in her as the one she reserved for situations that had gone past the point of gentleness. Renata, she said, my brother has been miserable for 8 months trying to decide whether to share something painful with the person he loves most, because he was raised to believe that how you say something matters as much as what you say. You stood up at their wedding reception and said something painful with no consideration for how at all. I think you owe them both an apology. The silence that followed lasted probably 4 seconds. It felt longer. Then something happened that I did not expect. My mother sat back down. Not dramatically, she just sat, like the muscles in her legs had quietly decided they were done. She put her champagne glass on the table. She folded her hands in her lap. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice was different. Stripped of its usual structural confidence, it was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I'm sorry, Claire." She stopped. "I didn't want to tell you what he'd done. I don't know what I thought. That it would be easier to." "Give me the shorter version," I said quietly. She looked up. Her eyes were bright but dry, which was the most honest version of her I'd seen in years. "I've been angry at him since I was 36 years old," she said. "And I've never had anywhere to put it." I stood there. The band had not played a note since this began. Somewhere near the windows, a woman was crying. I found out later it was Margot, my department head, who turned out to cry at things I would never have predicted. Near the bar, I could see 3 other people whose faces had done the thing faces do when someone else's grief accidentally opens up their own. 6 people would leave the room in the next 10 minutes. Not in anger, not leaving the reception, not walking out in protest. Leaving to stand on the grass outside in the warm May evening, because they needed air. Margot. Tom, Daniel's best man. 2 of Daniel's cousins. A woman I knew only slightly from the school board. And Simone, my maid of honor, who came back 20 minutes later with her mascara repaired and told me it was the most real thing she'd ever seen at a wedding. I looked at my mother for a long moment. Then I looked at Daniel. "Can I finish my speech?" I said. "A beat." Then someone at a table in the back, I never found out who, started to clap. And then they were all clapping, and it wasn't the polished, enthusiastic applause of a good speech but something rawer, something more relieved, the sound a room makes when it needs to return to itself. I went back to the microphone. My index card was still in my hand. "When I was 9 years old," I said, "I thought I said something that made my father leave. I carried that for 25 years. My voice was steady. I don't know how. I just found out tonight that I was wrong. Which means the story I'd been telling about myself, that I had this damage, this thing I'd broken, was also wrong." The room was listening in the focused, human way rooms listen when someone is telling the truth. "I don't know what to do with 25 years of an incorrect story," I said. "I expect I'll be figuring that out for a while. But I know this, the man standing next to me at that table has been sitting with a painful secret for 8 months because he was trying to decide the right way to tell me something that might hurt me. He drew floor plans of this situation in his head every single day. Because that's what he does. He makes sure the structure holds before he tells you how much weight you can put on it." Someone laughed, softly. Daniel put his hand over his mouth. "The soup story is still true," I said. "He drove 40 minutes in the snow. That happened." I looked down at my card. What I was going to say, before we took our little detour, a few more laughs, warmer now, was that love is not a feeling that arrives. It's a decision that's made, and then made again, every day, in circumstances that are not romantic and not witnessed and not documented. In Tuesday dinners and wrong room numbers and floor plans on napkins and 40-minute drives in the snow. I put the card down. I didn't need it anymore. "And sometimes," I said, "it is a man sitting with a piece of information that belongs to you, waiting, imperfectly, nervously, with his phone face down on the table for 8 months, to find the right moment to give it back to you. Not keeping it from you. Just carrying it until the structure was right." Daniel was looking at me. His face was doing the thing it had done at the altar, open, completely open, in a way that had nothing to do with performance. "To my husband," I said. I picked up my own champagne glass, which had been sitting untouched since I'd stood up. "Who builds things that hold?" The toast landed the way I'd hoped the original ending would land, which was quietly and completely. The room lifted their glasses. Daniel stood and kissed me before I'd even finished drinking, which wasn't technically the right order, and which I would not have changed for anything. The rest of the evening happened the way evenings happen after something real has moved through them, looser, more honest, slightly bruised around the edges but warmer for it. The band played. People danced. Tom gave a second, shorter, funnier toast at 10 o'clock that he'd clearly improvised on the fly and which referenced my speech without naming the thing that had preceded it, which was exactly the right calibration. Bex finally succeeded in getting Margot onto the dance floor. Petra found me near the barn door at 9:30, where I was standing with a second glass of wine watching the string lights move in a slight warm breeze. "You were incredible," she said. "I was a mess," I said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "Danny chose well." "Yes," I said. "He did." We stood there for a moment. "He was so scared," she said. "Of getting it wrong. That's what he was carrying. Not secrets, fear. He loves you too much to hurt you by accident." I thought about the phone, face down on Tuesday dinners. The closed browser tabs. The late call from the car. I'd read all of it as concealment. It had been something else entirely, the careful architecture of someone trying to build the right moment. "I know," I said. I found my mother later, near 11, sitting alone at a table near the edge of the barn with her shoes off and a cup of tea someone had found for her. The orchid pink dress was creased now. She looked smaller without her heels. I sat down. We didn't speak for a moment. The music reached us from the dance floor, muffled and warm. "Your father is in Indianapolis," she said finally, not looking at me. "He's been there for 4 years. He has a daughter from his second marriage. She's 13. I took this in. "Okay," I said. "I don't know if you want to know that." "I do," I said. "Or, I will, eventually. I need time to figure out which parts of the last 25 years were the story and which parts were me." She finally looked at me. In the soft light of the string lights, she looked like someone I recognized from childhood, before the careful composure became habitual, someone younger, and more frightened, and doing her best in ways that were not always good enough. "I was trying to protect you," she said again. "I know," I said. "But, Mom, I needed to know the truth. Even if the truth was that my father made bad choices and his marriage broke down because of it and I was a 9-year-old bystander. Even then. Children can survive their parents being human. They have a harder time surviving being given a false version of themselves." She pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," I said again. "And then, we need to talk about this properly. Not tonight. But soon." "Yes," she said. I leaned over and kissed her cheek, quickly, the way you do when love and hurt are occupying the same space and you don't yet have the language for both at once. She caught my hand for a moment. Her grip was tight. I went back to my husband. "The last month has been the strangest of my life," which is saying something given that the starting point is a wedding reception during which my mother interrupted my speech to tell me I'd destroyed my parents' marriage and my husband responded by showing her evidence to the contrary on a phone he'd been keeping face down for 8 months. Daniel and I talked for a long time on our honeymoon, in Lisbon, where we'd wanted to go for years, where the light falls on old tile and the coffee is extraordinary and the streets ask you to pay attention. We talked about the 8 months of carrying. He apologized for not finding the right way sooner. I told him I understood, and I meant it, which is different from saying it was fine, because it was not entirely fine. It was one of those things that are simultaneously forgivable and worth acknowledging clearly. The structure could hold the weight, but only if we both understood what the weight was. I have not yet spoken to my father. I have his number now. Petra tracked it down quietly through channels she didn't explain and handed it to me on a folded piece of paper, as if it were something old and fragile. I've put it in my phone under his name. I look at it sometimes. I'm not ready. But I am aware, in a way I wasn't before, that I have a choice. That the story of him leaving is not the story of something I caused. And the shape of that knowledge, the way it sits differently in the chest, lighter and heavier at once, is something I'm still adjusting to. My mother and I had dinner 2 weeks after the wedding. Just the two of us, in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, where she made the same chicken she's made my entire life and we sat at the table I've sat at for 34 years. She talked, more honestly than she has ever talked to me about her marriage, about what she felt when my father's debt came to light, about the specific kind of betrayal that isn't dramatic but is quietly devastating, the kind that makes you look back over years and wonder what was real. She was not trying to be excused. She was trying, I think for the first time, to be known. I listened. I asked questions that I'd never asked before, because I'd never believed I was allowed to. She answered them. Some of the answers were painful. Some of them shifted things I'd believed about my childhood that I hadn't known I was still holding. By the end of the evening we were both tired in the particular way of people who have done difficult, important work. She has asked, carefully, formally, in the way she does things she knows might be refused, if she can come to Sunday dinner next month. Daniel said yes before I'd finished relaying the message. That is the kind of man he is. I've thought a lot about what it means to be handed back a piece of your own story. The version of myself that walked into that barn carrying the weight of a 9-year-old's throwaway words is still in there. You don't undo 25 years of believing something in a month. But the weight is different now. It's the weight of something I can examine rather than something I carry without knowing I'm carrying it. And the speech, the actual speech, the one about the library and the napkins and the soup, got finished. I didn't read from the card at the end. I said what I said, and it wasn't exactly what I'd written in the drafts, and it was better for it. Daniel told me later, lying in the hotel room in Lisbon with the window open and the sound of the street below, that it was the best thing anyone had ever said about him. I told him he said that because he hadn't heard Tom's second speech. He said Tom's second speech didn't make him feel like the structure could hold. I thought about cantilevered beams. About the way weight, distributed correctly, makes something stronger rather than weaker. About floor plans on napkins. About the fact that love is not the absence of weight but the quality of what you build to bear it. Outside, Lisbon went about its evening. Tile and light and old city noise. Somewhere on the other side of the room, Daniel's phone was on the nightstand, face up. I thought, this is what it looks like, actually. Not in the big moments, those were real, but they're the easy part, the witnessed part. It looks like a man sitting with a painful secret for 8 months because he was trying not to hurt you. It looks like the thing that fits your life when you're not watching. It looks like showing up, and staying, and deciding, every Tuesday, over and over again. I'm still figuring out the story of my mother. I'm still figuring out whether I'll call my father, and what I'll say, and what I actually want from whatever that conversation might be. I'm still working out how to hold all the information I now have, about who my parents were, and who I became in the gap between what was true and what I was told, without it becoming the whole of what I carry. But I'm doing it with the right person. That, in the end, is the speech. If you've made it this far, I want to say something directly. Family stories are complicated in ways that have nothing to do with blame and everything to do with what people could and couldn't manage in the moments they were given. I'm not saying my mother is a villain. I'm not saying my father was simply a coward. I'm saying that people do things in pain that create pain in others, in chains that can go on long enough that you forget how the first link was forged. I found out, on my wedding day, that a story I'd been telling about myself for 25 years was wrong. I found out because my husband loved me carefully enough to carry something difficult until he found the right moment, and because my mother, for all her careful management of truth, finally ran out of room to contain it. The 6 people who walked outside that evening came back in. The music played. The night was warm. Daniel and I are going to be fine. We're already fine, actually, which is not the same as easy, it's something better. I just needed you to know the whole story. Claire.